My name is Eric Pratt, and as Hanan mentioned, I came from IHS, and what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to start with electronics in the big picture and how electronics fit in the big picture. Then I'm going to move on to semiconductors, look at where we've come from, where we're going. Handsets, looking at the market, changing consumer demands for handsets and what that means. And then do some hardware analysis. Now, I had brought with me a suitcase of some cool hardware that I thought we could all kind of pass around and look at, but unfortunately, it went on to Louisville, and I think TSA is now trying to figure out what to do with it. So maybe it'll arrive before the end of the show. But anyway, so we'll have to use our imagination there a little bit. But we'll kind of get into some comparisons of, the iPad has been kind of the benchmark and what goes along with that. So, looking at the big picture, what we're looking at here is growth sales. So this is growth sales worldwide. It's not GDP. So there is a little, overlap, but this will give us a good perspective of where electronics fit in this big picture. So really, electronics are in manufacturing. Manufacturing, by far the largest driver of gross sales. But there's a lot of other segments that contribute very heavily to that. And the takeaway from this is that electronics play a big role in all of these other segments. So certainly retail trade is big. Storage, telecom, electronics play a big role. Defense, electronics play a big role. So if we take another look at this, manufacturing represents about 31%. So if the entire gross sales in the world, $143 trillion in 2012, of which 45 million of that is manufacturing. And this is what's a little bit shocking. Within that, electronics, and this is electronic manufacturing of equipment and components, represent about $1.8 trillion, or 4% of the total. And components within that are about 500 billion, which are just over 1% of the total. So it's amazing just in terms of dollars how small electronics is. But yet its overall influence on the global markets is huge. Taking another look at this, this is looking at the historical cycle of the semiconductor industry, going back 30 years. And historically, it's been very technology driven. And I know for you folks have lived it for years. By nature, the semiconductor industry is extremely cyclical. But if we look at the early days, if we look at the early days, back in the late 70s, it was consumer electronics. I always think of that as the Walkman era, which really started to fuel growth. And then the next three cycles were driven by the PC industry, different innovations in the PC market. Then late 90s, we had the internet explosion, quickly followed by the internet implosion, which in that period, some industries were virtually cut in half. So it was a bad time for everyone, including electronic component manufacturers. Then we start getting into the handset era. But what's happened from about 2005 on is the cycle, rather than being technology driven, has been tracking closer with GDP. So now we're seeing the cycle of the semiconductor industry track closer with the overall economy and overall economic growth and contraction versus any particular technology. So a lot of maturity happening there. Looking at how we ended up in 2012, the total semiconductor market was flat to down, about just over 2% down. ICs, a little worse, almost 3%. That was driven very heavily by the memory market. So the memory market, you can see double-digit declines. The only reason, Flash, actually, in terms of units, had a great year, but there was tremendous price pressure there, and as consumers, we saw that every place. So Flash pricing really coming down. Micro components, down slightly. Discretes had a tough year, down 12%, but there were some bright spots. And we see optical had a good year, up 12%. Image sensors had a great year. And LEDs, that's about the third strong year in a row they've had. Now, LEDs have been driven, I think we can all see just where LEDs are showing up now, but a lot of the big areas, backlit in the consumer space anyway, backlit LED televisions consume about 50% more LEDs than the traditional edge lit. A lot of mobile devices now using LED technology, so really bright area there. If we look at it a little more closer by segment or by product category, 2012 is in the gray, and you can see 2012 pretty much across the board with a couple of exceptions. It was a tough year. 2013 is already starting off to be a much better year, and we expect that to continue. So memory, in its normal crazy cyclical nature, DRAM is going to have a good year, already off to a good start. But all of these other, you can see all these other areas in the blue are projected to have growth too. The only areas that are really going to have a questionable year is a lot of the very mature products. So not a lot going on there. You'd think prices would come up a little bit, but demand's, there's just not a lot going on there. One area, display drivers, good area, but we're expecting a lot more price pressure this year with display drivers, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, as just how display technology is evolving. So this is kind of interesting what's going on here. So the Capex is going to decline and going to continue to decline over the next couple of years. So, and this is the reason. This goes back to the very cyclical nature. But we saw, the financial meltdown here, 08, 09, Capex just dropped. Nobody was starting anything new. Then markets started to pick up a lot of expenditures. So you can see this aggressive climb here where 2011, 2012, huge investments, or actually unprecedented investment in Capex. So there was a lot of spending going on, so we would expect to see that taper off really till 2014. Now, there's plenty of capacity out there as a general statement. So a lot of capacity out there. So the investment, not surprising, is in new technology. To reduce costs, to compete and reduce costs. So as a result, even though you see Capex dropping, you see revenue on a pretty steady climb. Revenue is going to increase through 2016 as an industry as fab utilization goes up, as inventories come down, and as that Capex investment is a little more selective. So, obviously we see that as a really good sign. Again, looking at the forecast by industry, or by the semiconductor industry forecast looking out, you see the typical cyclical nature. Last year, I mentioned 2.1%. This year we'll end up about 5.4%. And what's interesting, we're expecting some pretty reasonable growth over the next 5 years. Now we have a lot of semiconductor analysts, and there's a lot of interesting internal debates. Personally, I think that we could see a little bit more upside in this area here. That's questionable. I think what we all agree on, though, is there is going to be no double-digit growth like we saw, 32%, 23% here. And that in itself is has a very stabilizing effect on the market. I mean, usually when we see these huge growth periods, that's when we see, the big decline. So, by nature, it's an extremely cyclical industry. I'm not suggesting that we're going to see complete stabilization, but over the next 4 years, all the indicators are that we're going to have some pretty steady growth. So that's great news. So what are the end markets that are going to consume these components? Well, I think the obvious one is wireless. It's big already, and it's getting bigger. So what we're looking at here, this is 2013 growth on the horizontal axis. The vertical axis is 5-year CAGR growth through 2016. So over here we see consumer datacom in the no growth, slow growth, decline phase. Still big markets. Just by the size of the sphere, you can see that those markets are big, but there's not a lot of growth there. Wireless be over 20% this year, and then about a 12% CAGR growth through 2016. So it's really where it's happening, and this is interesting. I was in give you an idea. As an example, I was in China last week, and I was meeting with China Telecom, and I think probably a lot of you know they're the largest service provider in the world. By the end of 2013, by the end of this year, they'll have 500 million handset subscribers. And I mean, to me, that's just unbelievable. I mean, that's more than the entire population of North America, really. And with that, they're rolling out 4G, which is much more technology component intensive. They're rolling out about 20,000 base stations where they're deploying 4G. And Huawei is the biggest provider of those base stations. Huawei was projecting, I think their revenue over the next 4 years is annual about 18% increase, up to $40 billion. So you can see whether it's wireless handsets or wireless infrastructure, this is going to continue to be a very hot market. Other hot markets, industrial is big, and we see that just with the efficiencies in the industrial space. We look at, we see a lot of smart motor controllers, for example, which are huge. They're much more efficient, use a lot less energy. Smart meters, which kind of cross over into the wireless space, but a lot of that still is in industrial. Another example, E.ON. I think they're the second or third largest utility company in Europe. They have a major conversion over to smart meters. It hasn't hit quite here in the US yet. We're probably 2-3 years away, but over the next 2 years, E.ON is going to be purchasing almost 40 million smart meters. And I mean, that gets into the consumer space. So here's a utility company, has no clue about consumer electronics, now starting to get into those volumes of consumer electronics. So as you can imagine, it's a real eye-opener for them. Automotive, we see it every day. Electronics in automotive, whether it's infotainment, whether it's engine control, user interface, automotive for the next 5 years is going to be huge. So expanding on wireless a little bit, looking at the handset growth. Now this is total handset growth through 2016. Now it's interesting, 2011 and 2012 were virtually flat. Now, it's ironic that those were the same years that the semiconductor industry had a huge Capex. So you see, handsets flat, Capex exploding. But there's something interesting happening here. And if we look at the mix, so this is ultra low cost handsets, bill of materials less than 25 bucks. So the very basic handset. Then we get into the smartphone range. So this is all smartphones. So what we had from 2011 to 2012, a huge transformation. Smartphones became over 50% of the market. Now, what we categorize a smartphone as, it's a handset that has an open operating system. It's a handset that someone can develop third-party apps for. So that's kind of our internal definition of a smartphone. It's pretty standard now, but it gives you an idea how this breakout is. So handsets taking over the world, and if you look at just what their growth is over the next 4 years, everybody's going to have a smartphone. Basically, here's just a little deeper dive into handsets. Now, handsets are broken into two categories. They're mid to high-end handsets. Now we have a new segment that's really getting popular. It's the low-cost handset. And we categorize that with a bill of material of less than $150. Typical handset now is 175 to 185, and I'm talking about material cost, just pure hardware cost. A lot of pressure to get the pricing down of handsets. Now, once you get past the definition, okay, less than $150, it's all over the map, and it's a trade-off in features, but it doesn't mean that the features are going to be compromised across the board. In fact, some markets, like certain parts of Asia, you'll see 10 megapixel cameras on a low-cost smartphone. They'll just skimp in other areas. They'll go with a much lower-end processor. So it just depends on the market they're serving. It gets quite vague there once you get below that $150 threshold. But the low-cost handset market is going to continue to drive the smartphone growth at about 12% per year over the next couple of years. So huge pressure there. Everybody wants a handset that does everything, but they don't want to pay anything for it. Welcome to the consumer world. Let me see, let me back up here a second. Oh, this is an example. This is just how handsets have evolved. So over the last 5 to 7 years, and I'm sure we as consumers have all seen this, handsets have changed a lot. So back in the early 2000s, and I'm focusing primarily here on displays, but we typically had a 3-inch display, very low resolution. Now we fast forward here, the Samsung Galaxy Note 2, which, by the way, I'll talk about that in a little more detail. But it's a 5.5-inch display, and it's high def. It actually has more resolution than most high def televisions. So really nice display here. And just as a reference point, back here, like this NEC handset, had about 350 components, maybe 380 components, and it had a material cost of, $160, $170. The Note 2 has 1,300 components, but it still has a bill of material cost. They range from $165 to $175. So, you can see what's happening. Component count's gotten really high, a lot of price pressure. And the ASP, or the material cost of the overall handset, really hasn't gone up that much. And that's going to change as we move towards the lower cost smartphones. This is just to illustrate the drive home, perhaps, the changing environment with handsets. So this is 2010, 2011, not a lot of growth here, but a lot of changes. We can see Nokia's in the gray here. Nokia continues their downward spiral, unfortunately. And you can see some other companies really stepping up. But if we look over to the real battleground here, and that's a smartphone space. So, Samsung took over the top spot here. So Samsung makes more smartphones and more handsets, actually, than anybody now. Apple, number 2 spot. But there's some interesting dynamics going on here. There's a number of other players that are coming up. ZTE's number 3 now, number 4 now, soon to be number 3. ZTE, Chinese company, Huawei, Chinese company, investing a lot, rolling out a lot of smartphones. HTC, Taiwanese, they were hot for a while, stumbled, but they're coming back, and they got a whole new line of some really hot handsets. So what we see happening here, Samsung, Apple, going to continue to dominate, especially Samsung. But we're going to see a lot of these new players with low-end smartphones. And if you look at, I mentioned China Mobile here just a few minutes ago. Their smartphones that they're going to market with to target these 500 million service providers are Samsung, ZTE, Huawei, and HTC. But the big ones, obviously the big opportunity there is Huawei, ZTE. So you're going to continue to see these guys make some major inroads and major presence in the overall handset market. Let me just fast forward here for a minute. I'll come back to that slide. So there's an evolving design approach to handsets, and this will give you an idea why we see a lot of new players. So If we look at the chipset providers, Qualcomm, still by far and away #1. MediaTek came out of nowhere, a few years ago. Now they're a major player. Intel, really spending a lot of money to increase their presence in the marketplace, and they're being pretty successful there. So what we've seen historically, we're seeing a standardization with platform designs. That's occurred. Nokia used to have 45 platform designs. That's just unbelievable. I don't know how anyone can manage that. Apple, they had one. Then they evolved that to a couple as they were taking on, different technologies, but very standardized. Samsung copied Apple, took that to a whole new level. So a lot of platform-based designs that the OEMs can deploy very quickly and leverage their components and their costs. What we're seeing now, and it's actually been happening now, probably 18 months, 2 years, is reference designs in handsets, and some of you may be very familiar with this. If a good way to illustrate it, if you look at the PC market in the early 90s, you had 3 or 4 big players, and they dominated the marketplace. Well, then there were all these reference designs where anybody could take a reference design, bolt on a hard drive, a display, or a CRT, whatever, and be in the PC business. Well, now with the handsets going to a reference design, and by the way, that was driven by MediaTek. Media jumped into this thing with a completely new approach to the market, where they were doing reference designs for handsets. Now Qualcomm and Intel both doing that. So they're offering a reference design, and that usually happens as the market gets more mature. Smartphone market is getting mature, like the PC market was, not a lot of differentiation. So now it becomes reducing costs, time to market, with that, you're going to see a lot more players. And I'll go back to this slide. These are some popular handsets in China. These are popular smartphones in China that nobody's heard of, really. But these are big volume handsets, and these are not gray market handsets. These are handsets that have been using reference designs. And a few of them are expensive, but some of those have a bill of material cost of about $120. So really interesting dynamic there. Samsung is going to continue to dominate. I mean, their product profile is huge, and their time to market's very fast. But they're not going to be certainly the lone player in the handset market. Another thing that's interesting that's going on is displays, and you probably see it just with the changing display technology. So consumer demand for smartphones, lower cost smartphones with larger displays. We're projecting the 5-inch and larger display market to increase 136% this year. It could be more now, to just over 60 million units. Now that's small in comparison to the overall handsets, but it's very significant. Now we attribute, or our analysts attribute it to the increased desire to consume high definition media content with your mobile device. That's all true. I probably have 5 or 6 colleagues now that carry around the Note 2. And I'm sure you've probably seen it. It's big. I mean, it's big for a handset. 5 years ago, you wouldn't dream of carrying a handset around that big. And especially with the difference between the Note and the Note 2 is they made it a little skinnier profile, so it'll fit in a smaller hand. And unfortunately, if I had hardware, I could show you, but you have to take my word for that. In fact, I'm sure TSA is experiencing that right now. Bigger, the ergonomics of the new Note 2 are much better. So the point is, it fits in your hand a lot better. It fits in a breast pocket. You can even fit it in your front pocket. I don't see as well. And it's really attractive having a larger handset that you can see as opposed to something that you have to put your glasses on for. So I see in that demographic anyway, from personal experience, I see it not only as being able to consume more high definition media content, but also with the aging population. But some of you may be familiar with AMOLED displays. It's active matrix organic LEDs. That's kind of been a hot term for a few years. Samsung developed that technology. It's really cool. I mean, I'm sure you've probably seen it. You know it when you see it. It's very high definition. The colors are just really crisp, almost to the point where you think it's not real, and that's been one of the knocks on it. But really neat, really low power. So, you know, with an LED, it doesn't consume near as much power. It was projected to take over the entire high-end handset space. That's changing, and the main reason is technology. The yields for the larger displays are still very low. There's about 4 guys trying to get into it too. They're struggling with it. You'll still see those displays, but you'll see them at the higher end. Hence, the consumers want a lower cost solution. So now what we're seeing is the display manufacturers just scrambling to come up with a low cost solution. And the most popular one right now is LTPS. It's low temperature polysilicon. You know, I don't know what that is. You know, you have to be an expert in displays. But what I do know, it's a popular low cost solution. And I don't think anybody's going to be looking at your display going, wow, you got a, you know, LTPS display. But that's what's happening behind the scenes. And what that display is about half the price of an AMOLED display. Not quite the crispness, but it's a compromise. It's still high def, and it can run a lot of media at a much lower price. So you can see this is an example where manufacturers are, you know, responding to this consumer need. And really, whoever wins in this space is going to be the dominant display provider. And there's, again, about 4 guys out there that are really jumping into that space. So with that, I'll shift gears talk a little bit about Microsoft Surface. Now, this is another device. I had a working Surface with an iPad that would have been cool to look at the difference. But I'll see if I can describe it for you. So, you know, Microsoft is, you know, as PC growth has slowed and mobility growth has increased, Microsoft's been out. You know, they don't have a big position in mobile handsets. You know, you don't see that many handsets with a Windows operating system. So Microsoft's been scrambling, trying to come up with a solution. The Microsoft Surface was their first big entry into the mobility market. Probably their second one after the Xbox into hardware. So they have good hardware experience. But this is their first jump into the hardware media space, and they actually did a good job. I mean, we were pleasantly surprised. So what this basically is, the format is like an iPad, with the exception the cover here. The cover folds out into a very functional keypad. And I know for a lot of us that everybody loves their iPad, but man, for typing, for doing emails, you know, it's not that practical. This is very practical. It also comes with a little stand that folds out, you know, so you can set it up like a desktop. So for traveling, you know, it's a great tool. The other thing, being Windows-based, it's much more compatible with a lot of enterprises that have Windows. And you know, I get challenged with that with my Air, where, you know, you try and integrate or you try and get into our corporate system, and anything like you know, HR or any corporate things like that. When it's Windows based, it's not that compatible. So I do see some real opportunities at an enterprise level for this device. This is just an exploded view. You know, it's relatively simple. This is mostly focused on the display. But let me get into the main PCB. Now, a couple of things here jump out. Congratulations to the Atmel team for getting a design win here. This is user interface over here. So this is Cypress has a touch panel controller. Atmel's in user interface. Samsung's doing the flash memory, not surprising. TI's doing power management IC, no big surprises there. This is a Wi-Fi only device. So it's an NVIDIA Tegra 3 processor, and this is an apps processor. Some solutions are integrated where they have the graphics processor, the baseband processor, and the apps processor all in one. This just has an apps processor because it's Wi-Fi only. So there's a couple of design versions here. If we get into this area here, this is just all interface to the Wi-Fi Bluetooth. Now it's interesting here. I'm using I commented on Atmel because I've seen they've had some pretty big wins lately, and getting into a device like this is huge, and it's not easy. One example I know of is Murata. They were designed out on the first 3 iPhones, got the 3rd win with it was a frequency control device. And it changed their quarter. Well, we all saw how popular, the iPhone was. I mean, it was back ordered. Foxconn couldn't keep up, and but it turned their quarter around. So, I'm not suggesting the Surface is going to be as big as the iPhone, but you can imagine when you get a design win like this, it's big stuff. It's very important. This is just, we also do a functional area breakout, and this is just to illustrate what's happening where, and this is very useful if you're comparing multiple devices. And you want to look at cost by functional area. You want to look at component count. You want to look at approach to design by functional area. This gives you the ability to do that. So, in the apps processor here, what we're including is all the supporting components there. So there's a lot of coupling caps. They add up in a hurry. A lot of frequency control devices in this area. Similarly with memory. There's a lot of supporting devices here, user interface, and power management, which is kind of spread throughout the device. So you can kind of just get an idea of the different functions and geographically how they're laid out across this particular device. This is the main cost drivers of the Surface. The biggest thing is the display, not surprising. It's a very display-driven device. So we have the display at $60, the touchscreen window about $48. So just those 2 devices alone are, $108 for a device where the overall cost is about, I think it's about $270. This is, but $215 consists of 13 devices. So there's no question the things that drive the cost of these devices: display, touchscreen, memory, processor, and then the enclosure. Typically what we see in these devices, those are the big cost drivers. Not surprising, here's where they show up. Here's the enclosure, comes in at about $552. Memory, here's flash, it's 32 gig flash. So the battery pack also, I neglected that, but here's the battery pack. Battery pack in these devices is always a cost factor. So top 13 devices represent $215 out of a device that the direct material cost is about $270. So just I'll wrap up just with a side-by-side comparison of the iPad versus the Surface. And just in the interest of time, I'll run through it fairly quickly. But if we look at the display, the screen, the iPad display is a high-def display. It's a great display, top of the line. Even though it's not AMOLED, it's an expensive display. So really, iPad has a display hands down. What is it, about $20 difference between the display from a cost standpoint. The redeeming thing here is the Surface display is a little bigger, lower resolution, and it's a rectangle, so it's very good for viewing media. So Microsoft really had that figured out. Processor's kind of a jump ball. Processor, no clear winner there. The A6. And the NVIDIA Tegra 3, both good processors. Similar cost. Memory, in this particular device, the Surface had more memory. Memory's cheap. Incidentally, Apple always wants you to buy more memory. It doesn't cost them much more, but when you go from a 32 to a 64 gig, it's typically about $100 more. Costs them about $2, so they love it when you upgrade. battery. And this is kind of interesting here. This display uses a lot of power. It's a power hog. Because of that, they have to really go strong with the battery. This is a 42.5 watt battery. It's expensive. The display on the surface consumes about half the energy. So you can get by with a much smaller battery. So you can see from a cost standpoint, iPad about $8 more. So the display costs more, the battery costs more. As a result, when we look at total cost of parts, about $293 material costs. If we do manufacturing costs, do some software royalties, we see a profit of about $296. So that's just some off calculations that we've done. So we're figuring Microsoft's making about, or rather iPad's making just under $300 per unit. Looking at this, total cost of parts, software, manufacturing, selling, this device sells for about $315, this particular model. So the reality is, for these particular devices that we just looked at, Microsoft's actually making more money than iPad.